I'm back again here at one of those beautiful lakes. There's a duck just flying across, squawking as it goes. You might see a boat behind me there moving, and right there, and there's another one about to come with people on it. This is a gorgeous spot. What a place to come for vacation. It's a nice place for just relaxing, doing boating. I see fishermen out there. And of course, it's because of that I've chosen this particular spot to continue this series on violence in the Old Testament. One of the ones that comes up, a very difficult one to understand, is in Numbers chapter 31. Let me just read it, Numbers 31. Moses was very angry with the officers of the army. This is verse 14. And he then says in verse 15, "Have you allowed all the women to live?" They were supposed to kill all the men, but the women were still living, he says. In verse 16, "They were the ones who followed Balaam's advice and were the means of turning the Israelites away from the Lord in what happened at Peor, so that a plague struck the Lord's people. Now kill all the boys and kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourself every girl who has not ever slept with a man." What it's suggesting is all the men who are guilty and all the boys who will be made guilty but are to be killed, and all the women who have slept with men, but to save the women who haven't. You can see why people are bringing this up. You can see why this is a problem and why people go back to Numbers chapter 31 and confront it. It needs to be confronted. So how can you answer a situation like that? Because it seems like the God of the Old Testament is very much involved in eradicating those who were guilty, but somehow saving the virgins for the men. I remember this was brought up at Speaker's Corner about 2 years ago, and we had to answer it at that time. And the way to answer that is to go to Numbers chapter 25. You need to go to 6 chapters earlier to see what the situation is. And when you look at that 6 chapters earlier in Numbers 25, you will see that the Israelites were staying in Shittim, and the men began to indulge in sexual immorality with the Moabite women. So the Moabites are also the same as the Midianites. They're interchangeable. You can use either name for both of those peoples. They invited them to sacrifices to their gods, and the people ate and bowed down before these gods. So Israel joined in worshiping the Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger burned against them. So you can see these people had seduced the Israelites. The women were the ones who had been used to do that, and as a seduction, they started turning away from God and turning towards the Moabites and the Midianites' god. Baal is the name of that god. So here in chapter 31, they were to go and eradicate the Midianites and the Moabites for what they had done to their men. Now, how many are we talking about here? When you look at Numbers 25, verse 9, and you look and see how many of these men were actually implicated, how many of them had actually been seduced. We're talking about 24,000. That's an awful lot of men, and you can see then why God was angered and why God demanded that they be eradicated to stop this plague, to eradicate this plague. So 24,000 had to be killed. Why? Because verse 2 to 3 said, because they were seduced to Baal of Peor, and in being seduced to them and worshiping their gods, they were also sacrificing children. And then God would only allow his anger against them once they had been eradicated, these men who were guilty. So what about the men? Well, not just the men. He was also said to eradicate the women and the young boys, but to leave the virgins alone. And the reason for that is not because of any sexual need of the men. It was because the virgins had not participated in this seduction. The virgins, by virtue of being virgins, were not guilty. And that's why God was saying, you're to leave them alone. And that's why Moses was saying it. He was just taking what God had told him. And you can see then this, once you look at the context, once you look at Numbers chapter 25, once you go back to what has happened earlier, you will then understand what's going on in Numbers 31. In almost every case, you will see that God has a reason for this type of violence. And this violence is not something like we had said earlier in the first talk that we did earlier on the 1 Samuel chapter 15 and Joshua chapter 6, God was not using this violence against everyone. It was only against those who had confronted, seduced, and brought the children of Israel away from God. Violence is there, but it's only for those people, for that time, and for that problem. Very specific, not universal. I hope that helps, because it helps me when I realize that and when I read that to see that God is not talking about violence for everyone, everywhere, at every time, like you see in the Quran, in chapter 8, verse 39. Slay the unbelievers until there is no more fitna, there is no more unbelief in the land. Chapter 47, verse 4. Cut off the heads of the unbelievers. In the very first 3 verses of that chapter define who a believer is and who an unbeliever is. And you can see it then says those who are the unbelievers cut off their heads. And then verse 5 and 6 continue and say, and those who participate in jihad, in doing just this thing, great shall be your reward in heaven. You're going and getting an automatic ticket to heaven. Chapter 9, verse 5, known as the sword verse, says, slay the unbeliever, besiege them, lay in wait for them with every kind of ambush. And it doesn't even, there's no criteria as to why or what. There's nothing specific about that. It's just a blanket statement. Verse 29 in that same chapter, it says, make war against the people of the book, the Al-Kitab. That's me. That's many of you who are watching this video, those of us who are Christians and Jews. So you can see in the Quran, it's very much general destruction. In the Bible, even the Old Testament, though there is violence there, it's only specific for a specific case and a specific problem that needs to be eradicated and rectified. That's the kind of God we have. Now we're going to get into a few more areas, but for now, this is Jay. This gorgeous, peaceful lake here in Florida. Over and out.